The pre-Socratic philosophers like Democritus or Anaxagoras thought they could explain the universe, including the living universe, without having to invoke agency. Agency, they thought, was the province of the gods. And by abolishing agency, the atomists thought they could liberate man from the gods, to set him free. The atomists' contemporary critics thought this was impossible, though. Socrates described the idea as next door to madness. What did he mean by this? Well, let's hear from him and his followers. Now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with evolution. It is germane, I promise. We'll start with the pivotal figure of Socrates. Socrates was a near contemporary of Democritus. We actually know little about him, except through what his most famous student, Plato, wrote about him. Socrates, Plato, and Plato's own student, Aristotle, are commonly grouped together as the so-called Socratic philosophers. Like the atomists, Socrates believed in the value of reason, but he thought the atomists were too quick to dismiss the importance of agency. The universe moved. It flowed from one place to another. It had a direction. To Socrates, this only made sense if something was driving it purposefully, from past through the present and into the future. In a word, Socrates was a teleologist. He didn't disagree with the value of reason. He just thought reason alone was insufficient. One had to know something about the purposeful end behind it all. To Socrates, the most telling evidence for this was that man was not only a reasoning animal, he was an ethical animal as well. Logic and reason were all very good, but there was no guarantee reason alone would lead to the truth. He had good reason for thinking this. There was another group of prominent philosophers in the Athens of Socrates' day, the sophists. They had mastered the arts of rhetoric and logic to the point that they could defend any point of view, whether it was right or wrong. So, Socrates argued, what good is reason if it can as easily lead one to falsehood as it can to truth? What would lead to the truth, Socrates argued, was reason combined with ethics. There was a right solution that existed independently of the logical arguments that supported it. Logic and reason were therefore only useful tools if they led in the end to the correct ethics. To Socrates, this meant that man had a purpose, to be ethical. A man's entire life should be devoted to striving toward fulfilling that purpose. This is what I meant in describing Socrates as a teleologist. Reason could help him toward that purpose, but the purpose existed independently of his reason. Socrates was a teleologist. So too was his most famous student, Plato, and after him, Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle, along with Socrates, of course, are the Socratic philosophers. Okay, let's return to this issue of teleology. What is it? Teleology has been described as goal-directed behavior, but the literal definition is the doctrine of purposefulness. Atomism does not recognize any purposefulness in nature. To them, there was only process. There was only cause and effect. Teleology, in contrast, asserts that cause and effect in itself is insufficient to understand the universe. The universe appears to be directed towards something. Causation might be the means whereby the universe drives toward that end, but causation is not the end itself. To understand the universe, you must understand that the universe is purposeful. I think it's fair to say that the whole endeavor of science today is atomist in its point of view. More to the point, it shuns any notion of teleology as being intellectually suspect. There is good reason for this, but science, in particular evolutionary science, is occupying shaky ground here. And this is why we need to pay attention to the teleological idea. Both Plato and Aristotle had a lot to say about that. Fortunately, unlike Socrates, a lot of what Plato and Aristotle had to say was written down. Our purpose here is not to go over the whole scope of Socratic thought. What I'd like to do here is focus on the implications of what they had to say for the nature of life and for our understanding of evolutionism. Okay, let's turn first to Plato. Plato's beef with the atomists was their insistence that everything about the universe could be explained by cause and effect. Here's the problem with that. Every effect has a cause, but each cause is itself an effect arising from another cause. And that cause, in its own turn, is an effect arising from yet another cause. And so it continues on in an endless chain of causation that fades back into the past, ending up with absolutely nothing. To get around this quandary, Plato thought there had to be some ultimate causation, which he termed the prime mover, or the final cause, as it was sometimes described. The word Plato used was demiurge. Through the demiurge, all the causes in the universe, each of which were themselves effects connected in some haphazard way, would be drawn toward the final cause. The universe had an end, and its end was to conform to the demiurge, whatever that was. Plato's thought has endured in part because it found new life as an avatar for the Christian God. Plato's thinking strongly influenced St. Augustine, for example. We'll be touching on that again when we revisit some of the modern controversies over evolutionism. For our present purpose, I want to emphasize Plato's conception of ideals. Ideals were perfect representations of everyday objects. The ideals resided in some kind of ultimate mind. Let's put this in terms of living things. Imagine, for example, that there are several types of starfish. You could have your five-sided types, some of which have arms, and some of which don't, and some of which have strange-looking arms, but still 5 of them. Some starfish have 6 arms, and some have many arms. All of these are starfish, though. According to the Platonic ideal, all of these different types of starfish were representations of a kind of ideal that we'll call starfishness. All of these different types of starfish would strive towards this ideal. From a teleological perspective, the ideal starfish is the final cause of all the different types of starfish in the world. Now, Plato didn't really write about starfish. He was concerned with other things like ethics, art, and morality. What Plato did think was that man could, by his nature, conceive of these Platonic ideals. There would be an ideal ethics, for example. Man could reason his way to discovering these ideal ethics, and he would continually strive to realize them. This striving to ideals was true for all of nature as well. That recognition of purpose in all of nature was what set the Socratics apart from the atomists. Another important thing to realize is that Plato regarded these ideals as independent of the real world. Final causes existed as some representation in a mind. They were disembodied from the nature that represented them. Okay, that's Plato. How about Aristotle? Like Plato, Aristotle was a teleologist. He shared with Plato ideas about prime movers, for example. He also developed a taxonomy of causation that we still learn about today. What interests us here is how Aristotle differed from Plato. Aristotle was Plato's protege at Plato's school in Athens, the Academy. After several years there, Aristotle had a falling out, and he went off to Asia Minor to found his own school, which he called the Lyceum. Unlike Plato, Aristotle was a hands-on type of fellow, far more tuned to the empirical world than Plato was. Among the things that grabbed his attention was life. Aristotle was, in many ways, the first biologist. He dissected animals to see what they were made of, for example. and he wrote down his observations and speculations. And he made some important discoveries. He was, in his own way, a scientist. Unlike most scientists today, though, he was a teleologist, like Plato was. Aristotle differed from Plato on the nature of the ideals, however. Where Plato regarded ideals as disembodied, Aristotle thought the ideals were inherent in objects and things, which were themselves the embodiment of form. Objects and things didn't just have an existence to Aristotle, objects and things became, and Aristotle's concept of form guided how they came to be. Aristotle argued that an object coming into being was basically matter becoming organized into the form inherent in it. To illustrate, let's come back to our starfish example. Aristotle would not have agreed with the idea of a disembodied ideal of starfishness. Rather, Aristotle would have regarded the different forms of starfish as being inherent in the starfish embryo. We're representing this as these tiny little replicas of the starfish contained in these little bubbles. Each of the different types of starfish became what they were because the embryo was capable of organizing matter to realize the starfish embryo's inherent form. Now here's the radical thing about this idea. To become a particular type of starfish, the embryo had to have a knowledge of what kind of starfish it was supposed to be. The embryo became a starfish because it took deliberate actions to become one. It had a purpose, in short, and its purposefulness was to become a starfish. Furthermore, it became a starfish intentionally so. Okay, I promise you that all this was germane to the topic of evolution. That's probably not seeming very clear to you right now, so let's come back to why I'm putting you through all this. These three schools of thought, atomism, Aristotelianism, and Platonism, are not simply the wanderings of long-dead philosophers. They have, in fact, shaped the entire course of Western thought about science, both of the physical world and of the living world. Whether you're prepared to recognize it or not, you are living in a world that conforms, in one way or another, to these thoughts from more than 2 millennia ago. Okay, but what about evolution? As I've already mentioned, evolutionism is not only a scientific issue, it's a philosophical one. To understand evolutionism properly, or to make an intelligent critique of it, we need to understand these philosophical foundations. So that's what we'll do. We're going to lay out a timeline, something like this one that depicts the history of life. The breadth of those spindle-shaped figures represents the prominence of the different types of living things depicted here. So bacteria had their day prior to 2 billion years ago, while animals and plants rose in prominence starting about 1 billion years ago. You get the idea. Okay, here's our timeline of the philosophy reversed from top to bottom, starting at the 4th century BC at the top down to the present day. We start with those three ancestral philosophical schools. For the atomists, the orderliness of the universe was thought to arise from the bottom up, so to speak. That is, the world we see is reducible to the rules of association between tiny parts of the universe that we cannot see. The atomists also thought there was no purposefulness in nature. There was no demiurge guiding the universe toward some end. There were only the mechanisms, the causes and effects. Okay, what about Platonism? The Platonists argued that nature was not only orderly, but purposefully so. The purposefulness of nature was imposed by the prime mover, shaped by striving toward the disembodied ideals. Turning finally to Aristotelianism, order and purpose were inherent in the objects themselves. Orderliness and purpose could be said to be emergent from within nature. Let's start building those timelines. It's a complicated history. Around the time of the 4th century BC, what we can call the classical period of philosophy, all three schools of thought carried roughly equal weight. We're representing this as the roughly equal breadths for each timeline. As the classical period passed into medieval times, Aristotelianism and Platonism came to dominate Western thought. Atomism became a kind of fringe ideology. What passed for science then was known as natural history, which encompassed the study of living things, as well as nature in full, including geology, weather, agriculture. Natural history was a kind of blend of classical Aristotelianism and Platonism overlapping to a large extent. The medieval period also was a time when philosophers thought they had a coherent philosophy of the natural world and its relationship to God. St. Augustine was a medieval philosopher, for example. So was Thomas Aquinas. You get the idea. Out of this came an important doctrine for our topic known as natural theology, the doctrine that all nature was a reflection of the Creator that made it. I say this not to endorse natural theology, by the way. I just want to make the point that natural history and natural theology blended into one another into a coherent whole. And this had an outsized influence on how our thinking about evolution developed. Charles Darwin himself, for example, was strongly influenced by the eloquent defense of natural theology he found in the writings of William Paley, whom he admired when he was a student at Cambridge. Things began to change dramatically as the medieval period merged into the Renaissance. Atomism began to find new respectability with the rise of chemistry and physics advanced by scientists like Robert Boyle, James Priestley, and Isaac Newton. Also around that time, the Aristotelian and Platonic views of nature began to diverge again. This period represented the beginning of the end for natural theology as its philosophical foundations split apart. From there, the science of life took three divergent paths. One path followed an Aristotelian outlook, concerned with internal process and mechanism. This branch gave rise to our modern disciplines of physiology and ontogeny, essentially the sciences of organismal form and function. A prominent figure in this was Darwin's French contemporary, the physiologist Claude Bernard. Evolutionary thinking began to arise around the time of the split. Lamarck, whose name you might know, worked at about this time, and Lamarck's contemporary rival, Georges Cuvier, sat astride the emerging split between the Aristotelian and Platonic outlooks. We'll be coming back to all these figures in subsequent lectures. Darwin's own evolutionary thinking, which we might term classical Darwinism, was distinctive because he made a tentative step into a quasi-atomist form of evolutionary thinking. Darwin's venture into atomism ran into heavy weather at the end of the 19th century, however, which became known as the crisis of Darwinism. Let's just note for now that the opposition to Darwinism then was not religious, but scientific in nature, and we'll be coming back to this in a later lecture as well. On the Platonic side of the split, students of life became concerned primarily with the sciences of living form. Linnaeus, who was a Platonic idealist, did his work on species and phylogeny around this time. This form-centered branch is the foundation for the modern sciences of taxonomy and systematics. These fields have run into their own difficulties, so I'm going to terminate that branch as I did for Darwin's foray into atomism. Curiously, the Platonic view of evolution has been enjoying a renaissance of its own lately in the form of intelligent design theory, which presents itself as a major critic of the neo-Darwinian idea. In many ways, intelligent design theory is a resurgent Platonic idealism. The rise of modern biology is similar in that it is a resurgence of biological atomism. Molecular biology is the most clearly atomistic of the biological disciplines, for example, but so too is modern evolutionism, which emerged from the crisis of Darwinism as essentially a newly assertive form of evolutionary atomism. This was brought about by theoretical breakthroughs in population genetics in the 1920s by three brilliant figures, Ronald Fisher, Sewell Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane. From their efforts, a new form of Darwinism emerged, which was markedly different from classical Darwinism. This was termed neo-Darwinism. So where does evolution fit into this? We've already placed Darwin as the boundary between an Aristotelian and atomist philosophy. There were other evolutionary thinkers, though. I've already mentioned Lamarck and Cuvier, for example. There were other 19th century evolutionists who were not Darwinian as well. Among the more prominent was Edward Drinker Cope, the American paleontologist whose present fame stems from his opening up the dinosaur fossil beds of the American West. But he also had some interesting things to say about evolution and Darwinism as well. We'll be coming back to all these figures and more in subsequent lectures. The point is that all, Darwin included, were embedded in a particular philosophical tradition. To illustrate, let's come back to touch briefly on this intelligent design issue. There's been a lot of heat lately about intelligent design theory, but unfortunately little light. Why should that be? Most of the heat comes from a profound miscasting of the intelligent design idea. Let me be clear about something. Just because intelligent design is misunderstood does not confer correctness to intelligent design. Intelligent design has to attend to that itself. Personally, I part ways from intelligent design theory in some fundamental ways. Nevertheless, I still think its critique of modern evolutionism should be taken seriously. I say this because intelligent design is fundamentally a critique of the philosophical foundations of Darwinism. Its critics want to criticize intelligent design as either a scientific or religious issue. No wonder there's such heat. Everyone is just talking past one another. That's why an understanding of the philosophical issues is so important. Okay, we have a little more in the way of philosophical foundation to lay down before we get to the evolutionary meat. We have to have a discussion of the nature of life itself.